biological continuity provides us with a second idea about what personal identity could consist in. Starting point is very simple. You and I are biological organisms. Very natural thought, therefore, is that our identity through time is just the identity of any other biological organism. So it's biological continuity, rather than, say, psychological continuity, that provides us with the key to understanding personal identity. Or is it? Well, let's see what the view says first. Here's a way of putting the view that I think captures the core idea. Now, of course, there are going to be lots of variations on this, lots of details to work out. Here's the core idea. Necessarily, a person existing at one time is a thing existing at another time, if and only if the first mentioned person's biological organism is continuous with the second biological organism. Yeah? Two things, person at one time, thing at another time. This one's biological organism, this one's biological organism. If those biological organisms are the same, then you've got one thing. If those biological organisms are distinct, you've got two things. Very simple idea. I think it's natural and very compelling. But I want to tell you a story that gives us an interesting result. So here's the story. Tom and Aisha swapped brains for just one day. Right? They were just curious, what would it be like to, inhabit your body? I saw a film recently called Your Name, a fabulous film, and that also involves something a little bit like this. And if you haven't seen the film Your Name, you should definitely watch it. On that day, the day they swapped bodies, a person we're going to call Aisha Body robs a bank. As night falls, Tom and Aisha swap brains back, as they'd agreed to do. Now I want to know, who is morally responsible for the bank robbery? Is it Tom? Is it Aisha? Or is it neither of them? Now just give yourself 90 seconds and have a think about how you would answer that question, ideally talking to your lecture streaming partner. So who is it, if anybody, who is responsible for robbing the bank? Go. So again, I'm really curious about what you're thinking here. Unfortunately, it's not possible now for having a little bit of discussion, but if you've provided the answer in writing, I'll surely be taking a look at that and thinking about what people think. So my guess, based on having asked this question to students before, is that plenty of people are going to think that Tom is morally responsible for the bank robbery. I think he kind of played a nasty trick on Aisha. He was like, lend me your body, I want to see what it's like. Probably didn't tell her that he was going to rob a bank in it and get her into all kinds of trouble. So my sense is that Tom is morally responsible for the bank robbery. I also think that you're only responsible for actions performed by things that are numerically identical with you. That's a very tempting idea. So a classic defense would be to say, it wasn't me. It wasn't me. So if you say to me, Steve, did you rob the bank? Right? I can say, look, it wasn't me. The thing which robbed the bank was distinct from me. It wasn't numerically identical with me. That seems like a watertight defense. Okay, but if that's right, put those two things together, it follows that Tom was Aisha body. Do you see that? It's just a matter of logic from those first two things. If Tom is morally responsible for it, and you're only responsible for things that for the actions of things that you're numerically identically. If Tom was responsible for the bank robbery, and if you're only responsible for things that you're numerically identical with, then you have to be Aisha body. No way out of it. Tom, you're Aisha body. But here's the interesting thing. Tom's biological organism is not continuous with Aisha body's biological organism, right? All that happened was we had an organ transplant. Now there's some faffing around to do here about, if you transplant brains, is that somehow really the essence of biological continuity? But look, when you think about that carefully, you're going to discover that Tom's biological organism is just not continuous with Aisha body's biological organism. That's not the case. Pretty much guarantee it. It follows that the biological continuity view of personal identity is false. So here's an interesting thought. On the one hand, the biological continuity view, super plausible, very natural at first glance. On the other hand, if you want to accept that view, you've got to reject one of these premises here. You've got to reject either the idea that Tom is morally responsible for the bank robbery, I think that's hard to do, or you've got to reject the idea that you're only responsible for actions performed by things numerically identical with you. Maybe that's the one that has to go here, if you believe in this biological continuity view. So just at this point in the course, we've reached a really interesting point. If you take biological continuity views, you run into the problem with Tom and Aisha that I've just been outlining, the bank robbery problem that gives us the inconsistent triad on the right of your screen. On the other hand, if you take the psychological continuity view, what we saw when we looked at that, do look at that if you haven't looked at it yet, is that there's another inconsistent triad which that view faces. Here it looks like if you want to hold on to psychological continuity, you've got to reject the idea that anybody who is a person has ever been an embryo or could ever enter a permanent vegetative state. So the psychological continuity and the biological continuity views have complementary, difficult to solve problems that we can formulate and get a clear idea on by constructing inconsistent triads. In order to defend one another of those views, if you think that's the right thing to do, you have to give a convincing justification for rejecting one or another claims from the relevant inconsistent triad. It's clear, no? Super clear. Very important. You really got to get this. If you haven't got this, just spend a while thinking about it, because it's really the beginnings to thinking seriously about personal identity. If you want to defend either of these views, psychological continuity on the left, biological continuity on the right, you have to be able to give good reasons for rejecting at least one part of the relevant inconsistent triad. Without that, you're not in the business of thinking seriously about personal identity at all. Okay, so where are we? We've been thinking about personal identity, and we found that there are seemingly difficult problems to both views. The next thing we might think about is whether or not we should accept these views, whether there's some alternative, or whether indeed we can defend one of these views by rejecting part of the inconsistent triad. Thank you very much. See you soon.